Okay, so what I'd like to do as part of this introduction video is give an overview of the different types of online assessment mechanisms that there are. So what I'm presenting are very broad categories, but as far as I know, and there's always a chance that there's something new, a new practice or a new technology developed at any time, everything that I've seen out there and read about falls into one of the main types that we'll be looking at in this introductory presentation. So the first of the sort of main categories is computer-based assessment. So pretty much quizzes. So these can be multiple choice questions, complete the sentence, drag and drop so that you're matching different categories. So there's a whole lot of different formats, but they're pretty much all come down to the same thing, which is a series of questions which the student can answer to assess their learning. And usually this is in as a sort of formative assessment. Now, the advantages of these are that they're usually easy to set up, the marking is automated, and they can be repeated again and again by students so that the students can test their knowledge. Usually you set up different variables and these are randomly selected, and so that if you're doing like maths or something, the actual specific values are different each time, but the principles of the question are the same each time. Now, these are usually really liked by students as they're effective for developing rote learning, and they're easily gamified. Now, gamification is a sort of fairly newish buzzword, and it just means the ability to turn something into a game, obviously. So you can have leaderboards so that if you get them 90%, 9 out of 10 questions right, you get to 90%, you're so far up. If you get more questions right, you move gradually up through, get higher and higher. Or you can unlock badges. And so getting towards the top or being at the top or getting badges, that can be motivating for a lot of students. The downside is that for many students, subjects, you can only test very basic learning. So you can memorize, check facts, get them to regurgitate facts, or and so on. For some subjects, you can set up something that's a bit higher level. You could, if you wanted to test information literacy skills, you could say, find out about this, what's the answer, and that then tests their ability to go off and do things. Or, maths can get pretty complicated. So although it might be a very straightforward answer, the process to get to that answer can be very complicated. One of the it's not really in this category, but it is in the category of automated testing, and that's computer coding. And there's some very effective testing of students' abilities with that because the computer can just run the code and see whether it works or not. But outside of this category, on the whole, and this is where the whole idea of massification of online learning breaks down, if you want to assess learning, you need a human to do it. There's only so far you can go with computers. So another form of online assessment is to set students the task of making an artifact. And you're familiar with this because we've done this on the course. And while I was doing some background reading for this, I came across a paper by Janet MacDonald and Peter Twining. It's worth having a look at the whole paper, but one of the bits that really stood out for me was this particular quote, which I've put on that slide there. And I think I can read that. You don't need me to read it out. But the idea of students attracted to the fun elements in activities, that can be a two-edged sword. So whereas some might see these as lightweight, and therefore, because it's fun, it's therefore not serious, and therefore is kind of debasing what they're there for. They have a particular perception of what higher education is, and if you're doing stuff that's fun, like making a video or making a cartoon strip or any of these things. Okay, maybe a cartoon strip's a bit frivolous, but there's some really effective stuff I've seen done with students about getting them to make videos. So you can not necessarily teach students about key learning skills, which is the example I did, but you ask them to make a video presenting key learning skills to other students. So, as it says in this quote, the issue of participation is of critical importance too. So it can be good in that all the students get involved and they all have different skills that they can bring to it, and sometimes students that might be not be as effective academically might be good at making making videos. So, and these are things you can do online because people can contribute different things online, and then somebody else can edit them and bring them all together. But then it says where activities involve online communication, participation is even more critical because so where it's collaborative, you can ask a student to make something on their own, and that then produces some sites of learning, or you can ask them to produce stuff collaboratively, but then there's issues because if somebody doesn't participate, then it becomes a problem has an impact on all the other students. Creating an artifact can be singular stuff on your own, can be collaborative, but I think there are a lot of benefits of doing stuff collaboratively, and hopefully you've seen these. But the other thing as well you can do with an artifact is a presentation. And in the first steps in learning and teaching, people created stuff on their own, but they did a presentation. But both of these things create difficulties and advantages as far as assessment goes. And I think from what I've seen, one of the most pressing difficulties, one of the most things that creates an issue, is creating an agreement about what is being assessed. Now, if for instance, you're trying to assess learning, and what I would argue is you're focusing on the quality of the learning that has taken place. But in the example of getting students to create videos about key learning, I found that this was an implicit assumption I had assumed, but it wasn't something everybody else had assumed, and they were actually judging things on the quality of the video, so the acting or the camera angles, all this sort of stuff. So those sorts of things need to be clarified in advance. It's nice that the students feel that they want to contribute those sorts of skills, and it gives them a chance of being creative, which is why it's a good thing to do. That's motivating. But then if we are assessing your understanding of the online support for learning, are we as assessors then assessing that in terms of, if we were to assess that, we're not, but if we were to assess it, are we assessing that in terms of how good it looks, whether you've used clip art or created your own art, or all these sorts of things? Have you used PowerPoint or Prezi, or all those sorts of questions? And there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, but I think these are things that need to be clarified, not only with the students, but also with your peers, who are the other people who are marking it. The question crops up with presentations. If you are presenting something online, as we did with First Steps in Learning and Teaching, are we just assessing the actual artifact, the PowerPoint presentation or the Prezi, or are we also assessing what the student said while they were presenting it? And if so, if that's part of it, then what happens if they couldn't do it live, if they had to pre-record it, or if they couldn't use voice at all and had to just use text? Do we take those things, those technological things, into account when we're assessing the quality of the learning? And ultimately, I would argue, but it's a matter of opinion, that what we're looking at is the content-specific, subject-specific stuff, not the ability to make nice creative artifacts. But that might be, unless of course that's what the subject is. But that's something to be thought about. So when they're collaborative as well, then we can also assess that using peer assessment. There are plenty of online tools to facilitate this, and I've listed some of them. They've usually got the word peer in them, which makes them stand out. But they're all pretty much the same technologically, but also they're very much the same because students just don't like peer assessment. It's seen as being something that's easily gamed, so that these people are all giving each other high marks because they want to give each other high marks, and if I give them a bad mark because they didn't contribute, they might give me a bad mark for giving them a bad mark. And those sorts of things are all elements that students fret about. Another thing that I've come across is that students seem to have this implicit idea that peer assessment is a way to punish students. It's there simply to punish the students who haven't contributed. So it's to force them to contribute, otherwise they'll get a low mark in the peer assessment. And all the great things that can come out about that, like reflection, about responding positively to good collaborations, that's not really self-evident to the students. So I think one of the key things, if you're going to use peer assessment, is clarifying to the students its purpose, the good things about it, maybe the bad things about it, and what its role in the overall marks are going to be. Okay, so next is online discussion. And that's, I think, hopefully you've found that the whole discussion process that goes on in discussion boards is a really useful learning mechanism. It's not always engaged with fully by all the participants. If you want to get students to participate, obviously the way to do it, make sure it's marked. But this is still an area that people find very difficult to find effective ways to mark. You can do it numerically if you set up a category of everybody has to make 3 posts of their own and contribute to and respond to 3 other posts. You can do that automatically, and that's then easy to mark. But of course, that's a very basic and instrumentalist way of marking something. It doesn't actually look at the value of those. And you can do this by creating a rubric. So, there's a link in the transcript. If you click on that, which will take you to an example of that sort of stuff. And that was basically, it's got to contain something to do with the subject of the course, and it's also got to use some sort of high-level cognitive processing in the responses, and then you can grade those as well. So you can have very poor thinking, very excellent thinking, very poor use of the content, very good use of the content. Problem is, if you're going to do that, going through all the posts to make sure that everything's been met is extremely time-consuming. But there are ways around that. One of the ways around that is to get the students not to mark the discussion board directly, but ask the students to go through everything they've learned from the discussion board, reflect on that process of using the discussions and good announcements, and then write it all up in an essay. Everybody knows what an essay is, so everyone's familiar with that as a concept. Everything you need to mark is in one place, and you don't need to revalidate anything from them. If it's an online version of a face-to-face course, you don't need to revalidate it in order to do the course online properly. The downside, of course, is that everybody's familiar with essays. It's just not really pushing students to try something new, and it's not really taking some of the advantages of what a technology can do. Okay, the other way around the whole process of having to mark discussion boards leads us to the final kind of assessment method, which is patchwork texts. Patchwork texts are also referred to as e-portfolios or as hypertext assignments. And you'll see a bit more about patchwork texts in the explanation of the assignment brief, because the assignment we're setting is a patchwork text. Now, these are actually really common in online courses. Most of the online courses I've taught have used patchwork text. So the rationale for them, basically what a patchwork text is it's taking lots of different separate elements, linking and then creating an overall summary sort of narrative, reflective narrative, which then links to these separate bits of material. So it creates one big hypertext document comprised of lots of different small ones. So why this is relevant for the online discussion board is that rather than having to mark all the online discussions, the student, as part of their patchwork text, might say, well, I learned this and this and this from engaging with the discussion board, and then they can link to the individual posts using the hyperlink. And but then it's not just necessarily discussion boards that can be assessed in this way. It can be their blogging. If you're doing an education course like a PG Cert, you can link in lesson plans and teaching observations. If you've given feedback to students or you've got feedback from students, you can link to those. And so rather than having a massive 40-page document or whatever, you've got basically the overall summative document, which is the bit that's marked, and then it's evidenced by all of these separate different links. So the advantage of this is that one of the things that we like to do in the courses is to build towards it. So you create separate different artifacts as you go through, and then you draw them all together. So it doesn't, these can be reused. You don't have to start from scratch when you're doing your final assignment. All of the work that you've done before, or all the relevant stuff, can be drawn into that final document. Also, the downside is that they can be quite enormous if you don't write the brief to be very specific about what sort of things go in and how many things go in. You can end up with a massive final submission, which can make them quite difficult to not only put together but also to mark. So, for instance, it's possible for you, if you say, well, you need to evidence your reflection about your practice, and then that's hidden away in a sub-document of a sub-document, and it's not covered properly in the summary document, then it can get missed. And also, so you can end up clicking on things and linking through them and reading the same thing twice because they're linked to twice and all this sort of stuff. So, so they can be unpopular not only with students but also with people marking them. But I think if the brief is accurate enough to say the overarching narrative, all the reflection happens in that, and then the subsidiary documents are evidencing this, and then of course also with this sort of portfolio style, those individual documents can stand alone and be useful in other ways. So, for instance, blog posts or whatever. So I think ultimately this is the one, patchwork text is the one that offers the most, but it also has its own disadvantages. So those are all the different sorts. There's the formative quizzes, there's the artifacts, there's the analysing the discussion boards, there's essays, good old familiar essays, and then there's the patchwork texts. And pretty much everything else fits within broadly one of those categories. So overall, it'd be interesting to see your reflections on what these different things are, put those in the discussion boards, and then good luck with the rest of this week of the course. Okay, that's it.